George Strait is stopped at the airport by a fan, and his reaction moves everyone. The fluorescent lights of Nashville International Airport cast harsh shadows across the worn face of Ray Mitchell as he clutched his boarding pass with trembling fingers. At 67 years old, his weathered hands told the story of a lifetime spent working with tools and machinery, but today they shook not from age or exertion, but from a mixture of anticipation and fear that had been building for weeks. Ray adjusted the brim of his father's old cowboy hat, a faded brown Stetson that had seen better decades. The leather band was cracked and stained, but it was the only tangible piece of his father he had left after selling everything else to afford this trip. The hat carried the faint scent of Old Spice and motor oil, a combination that instantly transported him back to those rare Sunday mornings when his father would emerge from his alcoholic stupor long enough to work on the old Ford pickup in their driveway. The diagnosis had come 3 months ago, delivered by a young doctor who spoke in careful, measured tones about aggressive progression and palliative care options. 6 months, maybe 8, if he was lucky. Ray had received the news with the same stoic acceptance he had shown during his 2 tours in Vietnam. But unlike the war, this was a battle he knew he could not win. The airport hummed with its usual Wednesday afternoon chaos. Business travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases and Bluetooth headsets, while families juggled crying babies and oversized carry-on bags. Ray felt invisible among them. Just another elderly man taking up space in a world that had moved on without him. His faded jeans and worn boots marked him as an outsider in this realm of suits and designer luggage. He had been sitting in the same plastic chair for over an hour, watching the departure board with the intensity of a man whose life depended on perfect timing. Flight 447 to Nashville had been delayed twice, and each announcement felt like another obstacle thrown in his path. Ray had never been a particularly religious man, but he found himself offering silent prayers to whoever might be listening that George Strait would still be at the airport when he arrived. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple in its desperation. Ray had learned through a combination of internet research and calls to radio stations that George Strait was scheduled to perform in Las Vegas that evening. According to his sources, the country music legend always flew commercial when possible, preferring to maintain some connection to the regular world despite his superstar status. Nashville International was his most frequent departure point, and Wednesday afternoons were his preferred travel time. As Ray watched the endless stream of passengers, he wondered if he would even recognize his idol in person. He had been listening to George Strait's music for over 30 years, had memorized every album, every song, every interview he could find. But seeing someone on television or in magazines was different from spotting them in a crowded airport. Would the king of country be wearing his signature cowboy hat? Would he have an entourage of handlers and security guards, creating a barrier between him and the world? The memories of his father seemed particularly vivid today, perhaps brought on by the stress of the journey or the weight of what he was trying to accomplish. Ray remembered the way his father's entire demeanor would change when George Strait's voice filled their small farmhouse kitchen. The angry lines around his eyes would soften, his clenched fists would relax, and for a few precious minutes he would become the father Ray had always hoped to have. Those moments had been rare treasures in a childhood marked by unpredictability and fear. Most evenings, his father would return from whatever job he was working at the time, already deep in his cups, the smell of whiskey and disappointment clinging to his clothes like a second skin. The man who had once been a decorated soldier had returned from Korea broken in ways that Ray wouldn't understand until he faced his own demons in the jungles of Southeast Asia. But when George Strait sang about small towns and faithful love, about the simple pleasures of rural life and the importance of staying true to your roots, something inside Ray's father would stir to life. He would turn up the volume on their old radio, close his eyes, and for those few minutes he would be transported to a place where his pain couldn't to reach him. Sometimes he would even hum along, his voice rough but surprisingly melodic. Ray's eyes began to water as he remembered the afternoon his father had pulled out an old spiral notebook and started writing. It was during one of his rare, sober periods when he was trying to get his life together for what must have been the dozenth time. Ray had been maybe 12 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, while his father sat across from him, pencil in hand, listening to the radio. "I'm going to write a song for your mother," his father had announced with the kind of conviction that only came during his brief periods of hope. "Something real, something that tells her how much she means to me, how sorry I am for all the ways I've failed her." His mother had left them 2 years earlier, unable to continue living with the unpredictable cycles of violence and remorse that defined their household. She had taken Ray's younger sister but left him behind, a decision that had haunted Ray for decades. His father had always blamed himself for her leaving, and in his more lucid moments, he would talk about winning her back, about becoming the man she deserved. The song had never been finished. Ray's father had managed to write 2 verses and a chorus before his demons caught up with him again. The notebook had sat on the kitchen table for weeks, gathering dust and grease stains, until finally Ray had rescued it and hidden it away. Over the years, he had read those incomplete lyrics countless times, imagining what his father might have been trying to say, what words might have healed the wounds that ultimately consumed him. Now, as Ray sat in the airport terminal with that same notebook folded carefully in his shirt pocket, he wondered if he was chasing an impossible dream. What were the chances that George Strait would even be here? And if he was, what were the chances that he would stop to listen to the rambling story of a dying old man about his alcoholic father's unfinished song? The intercom crackled to life, announcing the boarding call for Flight 447. Ray's heart hammered against his ribs as he watched passengers begin to queue up at the departure gate. His own flight to Nashville wouldn't board for another hour, but he found himself studying every face, looking for the familiar features he had seen on album covers and concert posters for decades. A group of musicians walked past, their guitar cases and road-worn appearances suggesting they were heading to Nashville for recording sessions or performances. Ray wondered if any of them had ever met George Strait, if they moved in the same circles as the man who had become a living legend. The country music world, for all its apparent size and scope, was still a relatively small community where everyone seemed to know everyone else. As the minutes ticked by, Ray's anxiety grew. He had invested everything he had left in this moment, had sold his father's record collection, his mother's wedding ring, and even his own guitar to raise enough money for the plane ticket and a few nights in a Nashville hotel. The doctors had advised against traveling, warning that the stress could accelerate his condition. But Ray had been beyond caring about medical advice. This wasn't just about meeting a celebrity or getting an autograph. This was about completing something that had been left unfinished for too long, about finding a way to honor his father's memory despite all the pain and disappointment that had defined their relationship. It was about proving that even broken people were capable of creating something beautiful, even if they never got the chance to finish it themselves. The notebook in his pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute, as if it contained the weight of all his family's unfulfilled dreams and broken promises. Ray thought about his father's calloused hands struggling to hold a pencil, about the way his face had looked when he was trying to find the right words to express feelings he had never learned to articulate. For all his faults, for all the damage he had caused, Ray's father had been trying to create something meaningful, something that might have made a difference if he had been able to complete it. A commotion near the departure gates caught Ray's attention. A small crowd had formed around someone, and he could hear the excited murmur of recognition that always accompanied celebrity sightings. Ray's pulse quickened as he strained to see over the heads of the gathering crowd. Could it be? After all these weeks of planning and hoping, was George Strait actually here? Ray stood up slowly, his knees protesting after sitting for so long. The crowd seemed to be moving toward the gate for the Las Vegas flight, which made sense given what Ray had learned about Strait's touring schedule. He started walking in that direction, his father's hat pulled down low over his eyes, trying to look casual despite the excitement that was building in his chest. As he got closer, Ray could see the distinctive silhouette of a man in a cowboy hat, surrounded by what appeared to be a small entourage of handlers and security personnel. The crowd was keeping a respectful distance, but Ray could see phones being held up to capture photos and videos. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat as he realized that his months of research and planning had actually paid off. George Strait was here, in the flesh, less than 50 yards away from where Ray stood. The king of country was dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt, his signature hat and sunglasses giving him an understated elegance that seemed to command respect without demanding attention. He was talking quietly with a woman who appeared to be his manager, occasionally nodding politely to fans who called out his name. Ray found himself frozen in place, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. All his careful planning had prepared him for this moment, for the reality of seeing his idol in person. How could he possibly approach one of the most famous musicians in the world and ask him to listen to his father's unfinished song? How could he expect someone who had sold over 70 million records to care about the ramblings of a dead alcoholic from rural Tennessee? But then Ray remembered the doctor's words about his limited time, about the certainty that this was his only chance to complete what his father had started. He thought about all the nights he had lain awake, wondering what might have been different if his father had been able to finish his song, if he had found a way to express the love and regret that had eaten away at him for years. Taking a deep breath, Ray adjusted his father's hat one more time and began walking toward the crowd surrounding George Strait. His legs felt unsteady, whether from nerves or his medical condition he couldn't tell, but he forced himself to keep moving. He had come too far to turn back now. As he approached the outer edge of the crowd, Ray could hear George Strait's voice for the first time, responding graciously to a fan's request for a photo. The voice was exactly as Ray had imagined it would be, warm and genuine, with just a hint of the Texas accent that had made him famous. Ray felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he realized that after all these years of listening to records and watching concerts on television, he was finally in the presence of the man whose music had provided the soundtrack to his most treasured memories. The moment had arrived. Ray Mitchell, dying veteran and son of a broken man, was about to take the biggest risk of his life. He reached into his pocket and felt the familiar texture of his father's notebook, drawing strength from the words written in faded ink so many years ago. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same courage his father had shown when he first put pencil to paper and tried to create something beautiful from the ruins of his broken heart. Ray pushed through the small crowd of admirers, his heart hammering against his ribs with each step. The fans around George Strait seemed to sense his determination and parted slightly, creating a narrow path toward the country music legend. As he got closer, Ray could see the details that made George Strait unmistakably himself. The way he held his shoulders, the genuine smile that creased the corners of his eyes, the respectful way he acknowledged each person who approached him. "Mr. Strait," Ray's voice came out as barely a whisper, lost in the ambient noise of the airport. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Mr. Strait, sir." George Strait turned toward the voice, his practiced smile faltering slightly as he took in Ray's appearance. The old veteran's hands were shaking visibly, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of desperation mixed with hope. Strait had encountered thousands of fans over the years, but something about this particular man made him pause. "Yes, sir," George replied, his voice warm but cautious. His security team had already positioned themselves closer, ready to intervene if necessary, but George held up a subtle hand gesture that told them to wait. Ray felt his throat close up as he looked into the face of the man whose voice had provided comfort during his darkest moments. This was George Strait, the actual person, not the image on an album cover or the distant figure on a concert stage. He was real, standing just a few feet away, and Ray suddenly felt completely unprepared for this moment he had been planning for months. I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Strait," Ray began, his voice catching slightly. "I know you must be busy, and I don't want to take up your time, but I was wondering if I could have just a minute of your time to tell you about my father." George's expression shifted, becoming more attentive. Over the years, he had learned to read people quickly, and something about Ray's demeanor suggested this wasn't just another fan seeking an autograph or a photo. The old man's hands were trembling, and his eyes held a kind of urgency that George had seen before in people who were carrying heavy burdens. "Of course," George said, stepping slightly away from his entourage. "What can I do for you, sir?" Ray felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as he realized that George Strait was actually listening to him, actually taking the time to hear what he had to say. He had imagined this moment countless times, but he had never expected the country star to be so genuinely attentive. "My name is Ray Mitchell," he began, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "I am a veteran, served 2 tours in Vietnam. My father, he was a veteran too, Korea. He was a complicated man, Mr. Strait. He had his demons, drank too much, said things he didn't mean. But when your music came on the radio, he was different. He was the father I always wanted him to be." George nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. He had heard similar stories before, about how music could provide healing and connection in ways that nothing else could. But there was something in Ray's tone that suggested this story was different, more personal than the usual fan encounter. "Your music was like medicine for him," Ray continued, his voice growing more emotional. "When he was drinking, when he was angry at the world, when he was lost in whatever darkness was eating at him, your songs would come on and he would just stop. He would listen, really listen, and for those few minutes, he would be present. He would be my dad." The small crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. George's security team maintained their positions, but even they seemed to recognize that this was not a situation that required their intervention. This was a man pouring out his heart, and George Strait was listening with the kind of attention that had made him beloved by millions of fans over the years. "He tried to write a song once," Ray said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the worn notebook. "It was for my mother, who had left us because she could not handle his drinking anymore. He wanted to tell her how sorry he was, how much he loved her, how he wished he could be the man she deserved. He got part way through it, but he never finished it. He died 10 years ago, and I've been carrying this notebook ever since." George looked down at the notebook in Ray's hands, seeing the worn edges and faded cover that spoke of years of careful preservation. He could see how much this meant to the old man, how much courage it had taken for him to approach a stranger and share such a personal story. "I am dying, Mr. Strait," Ray said quietly, his voice barely audible above the airport noise. "The doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. I sold everything I had to get here to Nashville, hoping I might run into you. I know it sounds crazy, but I thought maybe you could help me finish what he started. Maybe his words could mean something to someone besides just me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of desperation and hope. George felt his own throat tighten as he processed what Ray was telling him. This wasn't just about meeting a celebrity or getting an autograph. This was about a son trying to honor his father's memory, about completing something that had been left unfinished for too long. "Can I see it?" George asked softly, extending his hand toward the notebook. Ray's hands were shaking as he opened the notebook to the page where his father's lyrics were written. The ink had faded over the years, but the words were still legible, written in the careful script of a man who wasn't used to expressing his emotions on paper. George took the notebook carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. As he read the words, his expression grew more thoughtful. The lyrics were simple but heartfelt, written by someone who was trying to find a way to express love and regret in the only way he knew how. "These are beautiful words," George said after a moment, looking up at Ray with genuine respect. "Your father had a gift for expressing honest emotion. I can see why you wanted to finish this." Ray felt tears streaming down his face as he heard George Strait speak with reverence about his father's writing. For so many years, he had been the only person who knew these words existed, the only person who understood their significance. To have someone else, especially someone as accomplished as George Strait, recognize their value felt like a kind of validation he had never expected to receive. "Would you?" Ray started to ask, then stopped, suddenly feeling foolish for even hoping. "Would you consider helping me finish it? I know it is a lot to ask, and I know you were busy, but it would mean everything to me to complete what he started." George looked at the notebook again, then back at Ray. He thought about his own father, who had passed away just a few years earlier, and about the complicated relationship they had shared. He thought about the times when music had been the bridge between them, when a shared song had said things that words alone couldn't express. "You know what?" George said, closing the notebook and handing it back to Ray. "I think we can make something beautiful out of this, but not here in the airport. This deserves more time and attention than we can give it in a place like this." Ray's eyes widened in disbelief. "You mean you'd actually help me?" "I think your father's words deserve to be heard," George replied, "and I think you deserve to see his song completed. Let me make a phone call." George stepped away from the crowd and pulled out his phone, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. Ray watched in amazement as the biggest star in country music made arrangements to help a complete stranger finish his father's unfinished song. It seemed impossible, like something that only happened in movies or fairy tales. After a few minutes, George returned to where Ray was standing. "Ivy cancelled my flight to Vegas," he said simply. "My show tonight will have to wait. Sometimes there are things more important than keeping a schedule." Ray felt his knees go weak as he processed what George had just said. "You can cancel a show for me," he protested. "All those people who bought tickets, those people will understand," George said with a smile. "And if they don't understand, that is their problem. Right now I am more interested in helping you finish what your father started. Are you ready to go make some music?" The crowd around them had grown larger, and Ray could see people holding up phones, recording what was happening. He realized that this moment, this incredible act of kindness from his idol, was being captured and would probably be shared with the world. But for once, he didn't care about the attention. All he could think about was the fact that George Strait had just given up a concert to help him honor his father's memory. "I don't know what to say," Ray whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," George replied. "Just come with me. Let us go make your father's song the beautiful thing it was meant to be." As they walked toward the exit of the airport, Ray felt a sense of purpose and hope that he hadn't experienced in months. The notebook in his pocket seemed lighter somehow, as if the burden he had been carrying alone was now being shared with someone who understood its importance. For the first time since his diagnosis, Ray felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The automatic doors of the airport slid open, and Ray Mitchell stepped into the Nashville afternoon air alongside George Strait, ready to complete a journey that had begun decades ago in a small farmhouse kitchen where a broken man had tried to find the words to express his love. The song that had been left unfinished for so long was finally going to find its voice, and Ray knew that somewhere, somehow, his father was smiling. The ride to the recording studio passed in a blur of Nashville streets and comfortable silence. George had dismissed his usual entourage, choosing instead to drive his own pickup truck with Ray sitting beside him in the passenger seat. The country music legend seemed different outside the airport environment, more relaxed and genuine, as if the act of helping Ray had stripped away some of the protective barriers that fame had built around him. "Tell me more about your father," George said as they waited at a red light on Music Row. "What was he like when he wasn't tea drinking?" Ray stared out the window at the row of music industry buildings, each one representing dreams and ambitions that his father had never had the chance to pursue. "He was brilliant," Ray said quietly. "People don't realize that about alcoholics sometimes. They think the drinking makes them stupid. But my father was one of the smartest men I ever knew. He could fix anything, build anything, figure out how any machine worked just by looking at it." The light changed and George pulled forward, navigating the familiar streets with practiced ease. "What changed him?" "Career," Ray replied without hesitation. He never talked about what happened over there, but whatever it was, it broke something inside him. "He came back different, according to my mother. She said he was gentle and funny before the war, always making her laugh, always dreaming about the future they were going to build together." George nodded understanding. He had known plenty of veterans over the years, had performed at military bases and benefit concerts, and he had seen firsthand how war could change a person in ways that never fully healed. "Did he ever get help?" "This was the 50s and 60s, Ray said with a bitter laugh. "Nobody talked about things like post-traumatic stress or therapy. Men were supposed to be strong, supposed to handle their problems on their own. My father tried. God knows he tried. He'd go weeks without drinking, get a new job, promise my mother that things would be different. But the nightmares would come back, or he'd see something that reminded him of whatever happened in Korea, and he'd disappear into a bottle for days." They pulled into the parking lot of a nondescript building that George explained was one of Nashville East's most respected recording studios. Ray had imagined that recording studios would be more glamorous, but this one looked like any other office building, except for the subtle soundproofing around the entrance and the expensive cars in the parking lot. "The thing about your father's lyrics," George said as they got out of the truck, "is that they are honest. I've read thousands of songs over the years, and most of them are trying to say something clever or profound. But your father Gis's words, they were just pure emotion. That is rare." Ray felt a surge of pride as he heard George Strait praise his father's writing. For so many years, he had been the only person who knew these words existed, the only person who understood their significance. To have someone else, especially someone as accomplished as George, recognize their value felt like a kind of validation he had never expected to receive. Inside the studio, Ray was amazed by the sophisticated equipment and the respectful way the staff treated George. It was clear that this was his domain, a place where he felt completely at home. Engineers and session musicians appeared as if by magic, summoned by phone calls George had made during the drive. Word had spread quickly through Nashville's tight-knit music community that George Strait was working on something special, and everyone wanted to be part of it. "This is Ray Mitchell," George announced to the assembled group. "We're going to be working on a very special project today. Ray's father wrote the beginning of a song decades ago, and we were going to help him finish it." Ray felt overwhelmed by the attention and the professional atmosphere. These were people who worked with superstars every day, who'd been part of countless hit records, and here they were, taking time out of their busy schedules to help him complete his father's unfinished work. George led Ray into a smaller room equipped with comfortable chairs and acoustic guitars. "Let us start by going through what your father wrote," he said, settling into a chair across from Ray. "I want to understand the story he was trying to tell." And Ray opened the notebook carefully, his hands still trembling slightly from the magnitude of what was happening. The pages were yellowed with age, and some of the ink had faded, but the words were still legible, written in his father's careful script. He called it Unfinished Memories. Ray began, his voice growing stronger as he read. The first verse talks about a man who lost his way, who's hurt the people he loves most. He's trying to find the words to tell his wife how sorry he is, how much she means to him, how he wishes he could take back all the pain he caused. George listened intently as Ray read the lyrics, occasionally nodding or asking questions about specific phrases. It was clear that he was taking this seriously, treating Ray's father's words with the same respect he would give to any professional songwriter. And the chorus is about how love can survive even when everything else falls apart, Ray continued. He wrote about how memories can be both beautiful and painful, how they can haunt you, but also give you hope. He was trying to say that even though he had made mistakes, even though he had hurt her, their love was still real, still worth fighting for. As Ray read, George began to hear the melody possibilities in the words. This wasn't just poetry. It was the foundation of a song that could touch hearts and heal wounds. The raw emotion in the lyrics reminded him of why he had fallen in love with country music in the first place. Its ability to tell stories that mattered, to give voice to feelings that people couldn't express on their own. The second verse is where he started to lose his way, Ray said, his voice growing softer. He was trying to explain why he drank, why he couldn't stop hurting the people he loved, but he couldn't find the right words. You can see where he scratched out lines, where he tried different approaches. He was struggling to be honest without making excuses. George could see the eraser marks and crossouts on the page, evidence of a man wrestling with his own demons while trying to create something beautiful. It reminded him of his own struggles with songwriting, the way words could be elusive when you needed them most. What do you think he was trying to say? George asked gently. Ray was quiet for a long moment, staring at the unfinished lyrics. I think he was trying to say that he was broken, but that didn't mean he loved her any less. He was trying to explain that the war had changed him, that he wasn't the same man she had married, but that somewhere inside, that man was still there, still fighting to come back to her. George nodded slowly, understanding the complexity of what Ray's father had been attempting. That's a difficult thing to put into words, he said, but I think we can find a way to honor what he was trying to express. They spent the next hour working through the existing lyrics, with George asking questions about Ray's family history, about his father's personality, about the specific memories that had shaped the song. Ray found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, memories that had been locked away for decades, but now seemed essential to completing his father's work. Your father was a poet, George said, after they had gone through the entire notebook. He might not have thought of himself that way, but these words have a power that most professional songwriters would envy. Now we need to find a way to complete his story. George picked up one of the acoustic guitars and began to play, his fingers finding chords that seemed to match the emotion in the lyrics. Ray watched in amazement as the country music legend worked to find the right musical foundation for his father's words. Listen to this, George said, playing a simple but haunting melody. Does this feel like what your father might have heard in his head when he was writing? Ray closed his eyes and listened, and suddenly he was back in that farmhouse kitchen, watching his father struggle with his pencil and paper while the radio played softly in the background. The melody George was playing captured something essential about those moments, something both melancholy and hopeful. That's perfect, Ray whispered, tears streaming down his face. That's exactly what it should sound like. George smiled and continued playing, letting the melody develop and grow. Other musicians began to filter into the room, drawn by the sound and the obvious emotion in the air. A pedal steel guitar player added subtle touches. A bassist found a rhythm that supported without overwhelming, and gradually the song began to take shape. Now let us talk about how to finish the story, George said, setting his guitar aside. "Your father was trying to find a way to ask for forgiveness, to explain his pain without making excuses. What do you think he would have said if he had found the courage to complete the song?" Ray thought about the man his father had been in his best moments, the glimpses of tenderness and vulnerability he had shown when the alcohol and the pain weren't controlling him. I think he would have admitted that he was broken, but that he was still trying to be worthy of her love. He would have promised to keep fighting, to keep trying to find his way back to the man she fell in love with. George nodded, his fingers already moving on the guitar strings as he began to work out the musical phrasing for the new verses. "Let us create something that would make your father proud," he said. Do something that tells his story with the honesty and courage he was reaching for. As the afternoon wore on, the song began to come together in ways that Ray could never have imagined. The professional musicians brought their expertise, but they also brought their hearts, understanding that they were part of something special, something that transcended the usual business of making music. George worked with Ray to find the right words for the final verses, helping him channel his father's voice while staying true to the original emotion. They talked about redemption and forgiveness, about the ways that love could survive even the worst mistakes, about the hope that existed even in the darkest moments. "Your father was trying to write a love letter," George said as they worked on the bridge. "Not just to your mother, but to everyone he had hurt. He was trying to find a way to say that he was sorry, that he knew he had failed, but that he hadn't stopped loving, hadn't stopped hoping for a chance to make things right." Ray felt something shifting inside him as they worked, a healing that he hadn't expected. For decades, he had carried the weight of his father's unfinished business, the sadness of a story that had never been completed. But now, in this room with these generous musicians, he was finally able to honor his father's memory in a way that felt meaningful and true. The song was becoming something beautiful, something that captured both the pain and the hope that had defined his father's life. Ray knew that his father would have been amazed to see his simple words transformed into something so powerful, so moving. And as the music swelled around him, Ray felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for most of his life. As the evening shadows began to lengthen outside the studio windows, George called for a break. The musicians had been working for hours, and the song was nearly complete. Ray sat in the control room, listening to the playback of what they had created, hardly believing that his father's unfinished words had become something so beautiful. "It is perfect," Ray whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "It is everything he would have wanted it to be." George smiled and squeezed Ray's shoulder. "Your father would be proud," he said. "Not just of the song, but of you. It took courage to come here, to trust a stranger with something so precious to you." During the break, Ray found himself alone with George in the quiet studio lounge, sharing coffee and stories about their fathers. George revealed that his own father had passed away just 2 years earlier, and that the pain of that loss was still fresh in his heart. "I never got to say goodbye properly," George admitted, his voice unusually vulnerable. "We had some unfinished business between us, some things that were never said. Working on your father's song tonight, it is helping me process some of my own regrets." Ray was surprised by this revelation. He had always imagined that someone as successful as George Strait would have had a perfect relationship with his father, but he was learning that pain and regret were universal experiences that transcended fame and fortune. "What would you have said to him if you had the chance?" Ray asked gently. George was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "I would have told him that I understood why he was so hard on me when I was young. He was trying to prepare me for a tough world, trying to make me strong enough to handle whatever came my way. I spent years being angry about his criticism, but now I realize it came from love, even if he didn't know how to express it properly." Ray nodded, understanding. "My father was hard on me too, but for different reasons. He was trying to make sure I didn't make the same mistakes he had made." He wanted me to be better than he was, even though he never learned how to show me the way. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men from different worlds united by the shared experience of complicated relationships with their fathers. Ray realized that George S.'s willingness to help him wasn't just about kindness to a stranger. It was about his own need to heal, to find a way to honor his father's memory while processing his own grief. When they returned to the studio, the atmosphere had changed. The musicians seemed more focused, more emotionally invested in the project. Word had spread throughout Nashville's music community about what was happening, and several other notable musicians had quietly arrived to lend their support. "This is turning into something special," the studio engineer said to George as they prepared for the final recording session. "Dude, I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've never seen musicians this emotionally connected to a song." George nodded, understanding what the engineer meant. There was something magical happening in the studio, something that went beyond the technical aspects of recording. Everyone involved seemed to recognize that they were participating in something meaningful, something that would touch lives in ways that typical commercial recordings never could. "Ray, we're ready to record your father's song," George announced. "But before we do, I want to ask you something. Would you be willing to sing harmony with me on the chorus? I think your father would want his son's voice to be part of completing his work." Ray's eyes widened in surprise. "I am not a singer," he protested. "I can't carry a tune to save my life." "This isn't about being a professional singer," George replied. This is about honoring your father's memory. Your voice doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be real. And there is nothing more real than a son finishing his father's unfinished song." After some gentle encouragement from George and the other musicians, Ray agreed to try. They spent a few minutes teaching him the harmony parts, and Ray discovered that while he might not have been a trained vocalist, he had inherited his father's natural sense of rhythm and melody. As they began the final recording, Ray felt a connection to his father that he had never experienced before. Standing in the vocal booth with George Strait, singing the words that his father had written decades ago, Ray felt as if he was channeling his father's spirit, giving voice to emotions that had been locked away for too long. George's voice was as smooth and professional as always, but Ray's rougher, more emotional delivery added a layer of authenticity that made the song even more powerful. When they reached the chorus, their voices blended in a way that surprised everyone in the studio. "That's it," George said after they finished the take. "That's the one. Ray, you did something beautiful just now. You gave your father's words the voice they were always meant to have." Ray was overcome with emotion as he listened to the playback, hearing his own voice alongside George Strait's, singing his father's words about love and forgiveness and redemption, felt like the completion of a journey that had begun when he was just a boy watching his father struggle with his demons. "I wish he could hear this," Ray said softly. "I wish he could know that his words finally found their way into the world." "Maybe he can," George replied. "And maybe he's been waiting all these years for someone to help him finish what he started. Maybe that someone was always supposed to be you." As the final mixing was completed, Ray found himself thinking about his father in ways he hadn't thought in years. Instead of focusing on the pain and disappointment that had defined so much of their relationship, he was remembering the moments of connection, the times when his father had shown glimpses of the man he had been before the war changed him. "Your father was a poet," George said as they listened to the finished recording. "He might not have known it, but he understood something about the human heart that most people never learn. This song is going to touch lives, Ray. It's going to help people heal from their own family wounds." Ray couldn't speak through his tears as he listened to Unfinished Memories in its completed form. The song was everything he had hoped it would be, and more. It captured his father's pain and regret, but it also captured his love and his hope for redemption. Most importantly, it completed the story that had been left unfinished for so long. "What happens now?" Ray asked as the song faded out. "Now we share it with the world," George replied. "I want to include this on my next album, with full credit to your father as the songwriter. The royalties will go to a fund for veterans dealing with similar struggles. Your father's words are going to help other people find their way back to their families." Ray was amazed by George's generosity, but he was even more amazed by the thought that his father's words would live on, that they would continue to touch lives long after both he and George were gone. The song had become something bigger than just a personal tribute. It had become a legacy. As they prepared to leave the studio, Ray felt a sense of completion that he had never expected to experience. The weight that he had carried for decades, the burden of his father's unfinished business, had finally been lifted. His father's story had been told, his love had been expressed, and his words had found their way into the world. "Thank you," Ray said to George as they walked toward the parking lot. "Thank you for seeing the value in my father's words, for treating them with respect, for helping me complete what he started. I can begin to express what this means to me." George stopped and turned to face Ray. "Thank you for trusting me with something so precious," he replied. "Thank you for reminding me why I fell in love with music in the first place. Tonight wasn't just about finishing your father's song. It was about remembering that the most important thing we can do is help each other heal." As they drove through the Nashville night, Ray felt a peace that had eluded him for most of his adult life. His father's words had finally found their voice, and in doing so, they had given Ray a gift he had never expected to receive. The song would outlive both of them, carrying his father's message of love and redemption to people who needed to hear it. The notebook that had been his burden for so many years was now empty of its secrets. The words that had been trapped on those yellowed pages had been set free, transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Ray knew that his father would have been amazed to see what his simple words had become. "Your father's legacy is secure now," George said as they pulled into the parking lot of Ray's hotel. "His words are going to live forever, and they're going to help people heal from wounds they didn't even know they had." Ray nodded, understanding that this was about more than just completing a song. It was about the power of forgiveness, the importance of finishing what we start, and the way that love can survive even the most difficult circumstances. His father's unfinished memories had become a finished masterpiece, and Ray knew that somewhere, somehow, his father was finally at peace. As he walked toward his hotel room, Ray felt the weight of his terminal diagnosis differently than he had before. Instead of feeling like his life was ending, he felt like it had been completed. He had honored his father's memory, had given voice to words that had been silent for too long, and had experienced a connection with his idol that went far beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. The song was finished, but Ray knew that its impact was just beginning. Unfinished memories would touch lives, heal wounds, and remind people that it is never too late to complete something that matters. His father's words would live on, and that was a legacy worth celebrating. 3 months later, Ray sat in his small apartment in rural Tennessee, listening to the radio with tears in his eyes. The morning DJ had just announced that George Strait's new single, Unfinished Memories, had reached #1 on the country charts. More importantly, the song had sparked a movement across the country, with veterans and their families sharing their own stories of healing and reconciliation. The diagnosis that had given Ray 6 months to live had proven to be overly pessimistic. His doctors were amazed by his improved condition, attributing it to what they called a renewed sense of purpose. Ray knew better. The healing had begun that afternoon in the Nashville airport when George Strait had chosen to listen to a desperate old man's story about his father's unfinished song. George had kept his promise about including the song on his album, but he had done much more than that. He had dedicated the entire album to veterans and their families who carry unfinished stories. The liner notes told Ray Essie's story and his father Essie's story, explaining how the song had come to be and why it mattered. Ray had received thousands of letters from people whose own lives had been touched by the song. One letter that particularly moved Ray came from a woman named Sarah Henderson, whose father had served in Vietnam alongside Ray. She wrote about how unfinished memories had helped her understand her father's struggles with alcohol and depression, and how it had given her the courage to reach out to him after years of estrangement. They had reconciled just weeks before his death, and Sarah credited the song with giving her the words she needed to express her love and forgiveness. Another letter came from a young soldier who had recently returned from Afghanistan. He wrote about how the song had helped him process his own trauma and find the courage to seek counseling. He had been planning to end his life, but hearing Ray's father's words about love, surviving even in the darkest moments, had given him hope that his own wounds could heal. Ray kept every letter, reading them over and over again, amazed by the impact that his father's simple words had achieved. The alcoholic, broken man who had struggled to express his love in life had become a voice of healing for thousands of people he would never meet. It was a redemption that Ray had never imagined possible. George had also established the Unfinished Memories Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping veterans and their families heal from the wounds of war. The foundation provided counseling services, family therapy, and support groups for those struggling with the aftermath of military service. Ray served on the board of directors, sharing his story at fundraising events and speaking at veterans' hospitals across the country. At one such event, Ray met a young Marine named Marcus Thompson, whose story reminded him painfully of his own childhood. Marcus had returned from Iraq with severe PTSD and had been drinking heavily, pushing away his wife and young daughter. His marriage was failing, and he was on the verge of losing custody of his child. "I heard your father's song," Marcus told Ray after hearing his presentation. "It made me realize that I don't want my daughter to grow up with the same memories you had. I want to be the father she deserves, not the broken man I've become." Ray worked with Marcus for months, helping him navigate the process of getting treatment and rebuilding his relationship with his family. It was difficult work, requiring patience and commitment from everyone involved, but gradually, Marcus began to heal. His wife agreed to marriage counseling, and slowly their family began to rebuild. The day that Marcus celebrated 1 year of sobriety, Ray thought about his father and wondered if this was what redemption looked like. The pain and mistakes of one generation being transformed into healing and hope for the next. His father's unfinished song had become a bridge between broken families, a reminder that love could survive even the most difficult circumstances. George had kept in touch with Ray throughout the months following their meeting, calling regularly to check on his health and share updates about the song's impact. Their friendship had deepened beyond the initial connection over their shared grief about their fathers. George had become a regular visitor to Ray's small town, often stopping by when he was touring in the area. "You know what amazes me most about this whole experience?" George said during one of these visits, sitting on Ray's front porch and watching the sunset. "It is not just that your father's song became a hit. It is that it became exactly what he intended it to be, a way to express love and ask for forgiveness. He succeeded in ways he never could have imagined." Ray nodded, understanding what George meant. The song had accomplished what his father had been unable to do in life. It had reached his mother, who had contacted Ray after hearing the song on the radio. She was in her 80s now, living in a nursing home in Florida, but she still remembered the man she had married before the war changed him. He was a good man underneath all the pain, she had told Ray during their emotional phone conversation. "I never stopped loving him, but I couldn't live with what he had become. If I had known he was trying to write me a song, if I had known he was fighting so hard to find his way back to us, maybe things would have been different. Ray had arranged for his mother to receive a copy of the recording, and she had wept when she heard George Strait singing her husband words about love and redemption. For the first time in decades, she spoke about the good times they had shared. The dreams they had built together before the war destroyed them. "Your father would have been so proud," she said, "not just of the song, but of you. He always worried that he had failed you as a father, that you would grow up angry and broken like he was. But look what you've become. You've taken his pain and turned it into something beautiful." The reunion with his mother had been another unexpected gift from the song. They had spent hours on the phone, sharing memories and healing old wounds. She had told him stories about his father that he had never heard, about the man he had been before the war, about the dreams he had carried and the love he had felt for his family. As Ray's health continued to improve, he found himself with more time than he had expected to have. The doctors couldn't explain his recovery, but Ray knew it was connected to the sense of purpose he had found in sharing his father's story. He had something to live for now, something that gave meaning to his remaining days. He began writing his own memoir, telling the full story of his father's life and the journey that had led to the completion of Unfinished Memories. The book would include copies of his father's original lyrics, photographs from their family's history, and letters from people who had been touched by the song. It would be a testament to the power of healing and the importance of finishing what we start. George had agreed to write the foreword for the book, and his words captured something essential about the experience they had shared. "Ray Mitchell taught me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is help someone finish their story," George wrote. Not only did his father's unfinished song became a finished masterpiece, but more than that, it became a bridge between broken hearts and a reminder that love never truly dies. The book's publication was still months away, but Ray had already received interest from publishers who understood the power of the story. The memoir would be another way to honor his father's memory and continue the healing that had begun with their chance meeting in the Nashville airport. As Ray reflected on the events of the past year, he was amazed by how much his life had changed. The angry, bitter man who had boarded that plane to Nashville had been transformed into someone who found joy in helping others heal. His father's unfinished song had become the catalyst for his own redemption, proving that it is never too late to complete something that matters. The terminal diagnosis that had motivated his desperate journey to meet George Strait had proven to be wrong in its timeline, but right in its urgency. Ray had needed the pressure of mortality to find the courage to honor his father's memory, and in doing so, he had discovered a reason to keep living. Unfinished Memories continued to climb the charts and win awards, but its real success was measured in the lives it had touched. The song had become an anthem for families dealing with trauma, a reminder that healing was possible even after years of pain. Ray's father, the broken alcoholic who had died feeling like a failure, had posthumously become a voice of hope for millions of people. On the first anniversary of their meeting, George called Ray with exciting news. Unfinished Memories had been nominated for Song of the Year at the Country Music Awards, and Ray was invited to attend the ceremony as George's guest. More importantly, they had been asked to perform the song together live on television. Sharing the story of how it came to be, Ray was nervous about performing in front of such a large audience, but George assured him that his voice was exactly what the song needed. "You were not just singing harmony," George explained. "Now you're completing the circle. Your father started this song, and you're going to help me finish it in front of the whole world." The performance was everything Ray had hoped it would be. Standing on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, singing his father's words alongside George Strait, Ray felt a connection to something larger than himself. In the audience, he could see people wiping away tears, understanding that they were witnessing something special. When the song ended, The audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Ray looked out at the crowd and thought about his father, wondering if he could have ever imagined that his simple words would one day be performed on the most famous stage in country music. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said into the microphone, "the co-writer of Unfinished Memories, Ray Mitchell." Ray stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "My father never got to finish this song in life," he said. "But tonight, with your help and George's generosity, his words have found their way home. Thank you for listening to his story and for helping me complete what he started." The song won the award that night, but more importantly, it continued to touch lives and heal wounds. Ray's father had finally found his voice, and that voice was speaking to anyone who had ever felt broken, anyone who had ever needed to ask for forgiveness, anyone who had ever wondered if love could survive the worst mistakes. As Ray held the award and looked out at the audience, he realized that his father's Unfinished Memories had become a finished masterpiece. The song would outlive both of them, carrying its message of hope and redemption to future generations. His father's legacy was secure, and Ray's own story had found its perfect ending. The broken man who had started this journey seeking closure had found something far more valuable. He had found healing, purpose, and the knowledge that love truly never dies. His father's unfinished song had become a finished symphony, and Ray knew that somewhere, somehow, his father was finally at peace.